Wow, wow, wow. I have to admit that I'm rather humbled being up here today as we have moved through the service and I have heard some of the language of the liturgy, the crossing the sea, the touching the earth, the language in the anthem about being lost and then found, the rainbow that I saw many of while I was on my trips in Europe and across the western United States. So much of what we have already talked about today brought back so many memories of these pilgrimages, and I feel like I'm carrying all those experiences with me right now, and to have the opportunity to share some of that with you leaves me very humbled, and I'm just very pleased to be able to share some of those experiences with you. Our gospel lesson today is from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, verses 30 through 46. And traditionally, we know this story as the feeding of the 5,000. But I'd like you to notice something maybe that you have not seen before, that this particular text opens and closes with sort of bookends to the feeding of the 5,000. So as we listen to the gospel, I would like you to listen for the pulse of God, the life of God, the Spirit of God in this text. The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And Jesus said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. As Jesus went ashore, he saw this great crowd. And he had compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. When it grew late, the disciples said to him, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now very late. Send them away, so that they may now go into the surrounding country and villages and buy something for themselves to eat." But Jesus answered them, "You give them something to eat." They said to him, "Are we to go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves have you? Go and see." When they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he ordered them to get all the people to sit down in groups on the green grass, and so they sat down in groups of hundreds and of 50s. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, he blessed and he broke the loaves, and he gave it to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And all ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. Those who had eaten the loaves numbered 5,000 men, which means 5,000 families. Immediately he made the disciples then get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And after saying farewell to them, he went up to the mountain to pray. May God bless the reading of the word. Now, I have to admit that if I were one of the disciples, I might be just a little bit annoyed with Jesus in this scene. Did you catch how easily Jesus got distracted from the original purpose that they had set out to do? For in the beginning of the lesson in Mark, Jesus instructs the disciples very clearly, "Come away now to a deserted place for ourselves so we can rest a while." And the narrator tells us that so many people were coming and going that Jesus and the disciples did not even have enough leisure even to eat. We know how that is sometimes, missing lunch when we're busy. And so what Jesus is basically saying is, we have got to get some space, and we have to get it now. But look what happens. It appears that maybe Jesus is just a bit of a softie. For when a crowd of 5,000 raced ahead of them, Jesus' compassion and sympathy for the people became more important than their hungry stomachs and their need for some peace, some quiet, and for some space. And it appears that the text takes a monumental detour in a story that we often think of as the feeding of the 5,000. But did you catch how the story also ended? It ends with Jesus once again instructing the disciples then to get onto a boat, get into a secluded place, go to some place that's deserted. And after dismissing the crowd, he himself also went up to the mountain to pray. The story finally ends the way it was intended to begin. And I'm wondering if maybe this might sound vaguely familiar. It seems that our biblical characters maybe have some of the same issues and problems that we do with organizing and running our lives. We keep promising ourselves and maybe our families and our friends that we will eventually slow things down, that we will take it a little more easy, and we say that next week I'm going to take that one day for myself. And then the next week comes and the faucet is leaky, your spouse might be agitated, and Kohl's has a one-day sale that you just can't miss. And so you promise yourself, next week I'll take a Brian day and finally do all those things I needed to do, take a day just for myself after all of the tasks are done. And you know the story. The next week comes around and now the lawnmower is broken. Your out-of-state daughter calls you in tears, and your church needs volunteers just for one day, the same day that you were hoping to take for yourself. Let us go to a deserted place, Jesus instructs his disciples. Oh, but hang on. Just as soon as we've fed the 5,000 families. I wonder if it sounds vaguely familiar to any of you. I know those of us who are pastors certainly recognize this. I'll focus on my needs just as soon as everyone else's needs have finally been met. As I said earlier, it's a great pleasure for me to be able to preach here this Sunday on the first Sunday of Lent as you begin these 40 days of spiritual disciplines, and to honor this theme of pilgrimage. For those of you who were here last week, you know that the theme of pilgrimage is very close to my life and my heart and my soul. Because in the last 4 years, I have carved out a pretty significant amount of time so that I could take 2 separate pilgrimages. The first was a little bike ride around the American West where I took off 10 weeks and rode 4,000 miles through the states of Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, California, and then back up to Portland again. And then this last fall, I flew over to Europe where I started in Rome and rode through Catholic Italy, Orthodox Greece, and then into the heart of Muslim Turkey. 2 amazing experiences that I will never forget. And I don't know if that sounds maybe a little overly ambitious to you, or maybe just a little slightly crazy. But what I do know is this. that I took those pilgrimages when my soul was finally crying out in my life, no more. No more. You can't put me off one more year, one more month, even one more week. Brian, I need your attention now. I took these pilgrimages at the time in my life when I felt like I was risking the death of my own soul. Now, I don't mean that I was physically dying, although on some days I sort of wondered if I was experiencing that. But what I mean is that part of me that's most passionate about life, that part of me that longs to find delight and joy in my daily living, that part of me that wants to fall in love with life and with God over and over again was at serious risk. And I knew over this period that I was dying inside. And as I look back at this period, I think it started in the year 2002, when my father-in-law died after a 4-year struggle with dementia and Alzheimer's. A year later, his fairly healthy 68-year-old wife suffered a stroke. And we then moved her up to Portland where we could monitor and take care of her better. 3 years later, in the midst of all of that care, work, and caring for an elderly parent and teenage children, my wife of 25 years suddenly left one night. The next year, my mother-in-law, who had the stroke, died after her own 4-year struggle. And then 11 months later, my stepmother died unexpectedly during what is somewhat routine heart valve replacement surgery. And so during those last 3 years, I lost the 3 most important women in my life. And as I examined my life and what was taking place, it felt like that everywhere I turned, I was facing loss. I was facing death. It was all going away. But you know, for as difficult as that was and those experiences were, I think what actually took me over the edge and pushed me to these pilgrimages was my role as a pastor in a rather unique situation in Portland. Because I had former hospice work experience in my past, I was called to a church that was dangerously close to closing. It was expected that they would close. And so the very definition of my work was to help them, in the midst of all of my grief and loss, to help them face their organizational legacy and death as well. And the irony of work like that is that the only way to do a really good job is actually to work your way out of a job. Success in that context is to work your way out of a job. And so by 2010, not only had I had personal losses, but I was working in a church that by nature would mean another loss, and I was even the one doing the work. And I'm part of a denomination where every year churches cut their budgets and their staff. You see, everywhere I turned, family and work, it felt like my world was dissolving away. And so in the fall of 2010, I could hear it. My soul finally started to cry out, saying to me loud and clear, I need to live again. I need to feel alive again. And the words and the spirit of Psalm 42 were on my lips and close to my heart. As a deer pants for flowing streams, my soul longs for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and behold the face of God? My tears have been my food day and night. I knew what those words meant. And so after 8 years of continual losses and a future that, at least in my head, seemed just as dismal, I finally had reached a point where I had to make some decisions. Because I wanted to live again. I wanted to feel again. I wanted to laugh again. I wanted to recover that part of me that felt alive, truly alive. I was thirsting. I was panting for that God who gives living water. And so, like Jesus and the disciples in this text in Mark, I began planning for a little space, a little rest. I began looking for that deserted place where I could find this God who brings life and love and joy, where I could restore my dying soul, and where I could sneak away from all of the demands of ministry, of parenting, of household responsibilities, of bills and schedules and expectations. And so I took off. I took off twice. Once for 10 weeks across the expansive American West, and then more recently for 7 weeks to Europe and the Middle East. I felt that I had to have space in some way so that I could recover the passion and the spark and the soulfulness that I had felt 10, 15, 20 years before that. And what it really came down to for me is this. I had to find a way to define myself by something other than loss. The recent years had all become about survival and loss, and I needed to find a new way to define who I was, what I was about, and where I was going. Now, as we are kicking off this pilgrimage theme for Lent here in the church, I do want to assure you that this is not in any way my attempt to convince you that you also have to take 2 months off if you're ever going to have a chance to experience the closeness of God. And I'm also not going to say that in order to recover your lost self, if that is what is taking place in your life, that you have to set off on some grand bicycle adventure or do what Cheryl Strayed did in Wild, the Pacific Coast Trail. You don't have to cross mountains, survive deserts, and risk yourself on foreign soil. Now, I did discover those things don't hurt, but there are many other ways to make room for God in our lives. But what this sermon is about is how deeply I believe that if we want God to show up in our lives, we do have to be intentional about it. We do need to make space. And it doesn't have to be 7 weeks in Europe or on some major hiking trail. It doesn't have to be 3 days at Mount Angel for a retreat, such as your custom here. It doesn't even have to be a regular pattern of silence in the church. But I do believe that one way or another, that we do need to create space in our lives, in our schedules, within our hearts, within our minds, if God is going to be able to show up. Because my experience is this, that if we don't carve out the space, if we're not intentional about it, we can be sure that something else will grab our attention and that somebody else will weasel their way into your purview, into your time, and into your schedule. And that's really what the period of Lent is all about. It's about being intentional. It's about developing a discipline. It's about making a commitment to create some space in your life. I like to think of it as a time when we are allowed to wander a little bit in our faith and in our souls just to see what surprise God might have for us. We often think of Lent and some of the spiritual disciplines of the church as having to add more to our schedule. We're already very busy, and then we come to Lent, and then we have more classes to go to, more disciplines to add into our lives. But I want to say that Lent is not so much about doing more and adding more. It's about the intentionality of doing less, making the decisions so that you do less and therefore make more room for God to show up. But lest you think that this is easy, again, go back to our text today. Because remember just how hard it was even for Jesus. Not that he did the wrong thing. I would never say that. But that he went with one intention and did something else. We often think of this lesson as the feeding of the 5,000, but it actually begins with an intention to get some space. They were so busy they weren't even eating. This text starts off with an intention to get some rest and some space. And then once again, the needs of others took precedence. And I really think that Jesus' world is not really all that much different from our world. His struggle was with the constant pressure of people and crowds who were begging for his attention and his time, his teaching, and his healing. Maybe we have a slightly different struggle, but our struggle, I think, is with 24-hour information overload. Our lives and our attention is invaded by smartphones, by emails, by texts, by TV, by computers, by visual billboards as we're driving, by the street corner Statue of Liberties we're selling tax services, and maybe even most invasive of all, the constant barrage of voices in our heads that are clamoring for attention. Voices from the past, the shoulds and the should-have-beens, the constant chatter in our own heads. And what I've come to experience and to believe is that if we really want a conversation with God, the creator of the universe, that God, if we truly want to honor the yearning and the panting of our own souls, those things that make us tick, those things that we are most passionate about, that we do need to make space. We need to work at it and be intentional. Because if we don't, and I think we all know this, that the world will snatch up every single minute that we give it access to. At least that's been my experience. And that is why, after 14 years of ministry and raising 2 children, I discovered that making room for God wasn't going to just miraculously land on my doorstep one day. I had to be the one to initiate it. I had to take action. I had to find a way to carve out space in my day, in my week, and in this case, in my year and in my life. And so once again, my story has been that I ended up taking off on 2 wonderful, grand, unpredictable, nerve-wracking adventures. And both of them took a lot of preparation and planning. The first one, I already had 3 weeks of vacation and 5 weeks of study leave saved up, so with a 2-week gift from the church, I was able to take a little over 2 months out of my life for that pilgrimage. But it was the second pilgrimage that was a little more complicated. I timed it with the ending of an interim position in Yachats. But of course, there were also financial issues to contend with. And so a year before the pilgrimage, I gave away 90% of my possessions. And I watched as a St. Vincent's moving van and my children drove away with 30 years' worth of stored up possessions. I then found a house-sitting arrangement. I lived a very simple life for a year, and I was able then to save about $1,000 a month on money that would have gone toward rent. And it was that $10,000 that allowed me to take the time and support myself during the pilgrimage to Italy, Greece, and Turkey. But the real gift was this. I received an unexpected gift just before I left. Prior to my leaving, I had spent 4 months negotiating for a half-time position that I would be able to return to. And then, because of circumstances that were beyond my control, that position suddenly unraveled just 8 days before I left for Europe. It was a sobering and stunning development after all of my planning. At first, it was rather unnerving. But it wasn't long, however, until about 2 weeks into the pilgrimage, that I realized that I actually had received the best gift I could have received. You see, for the first time in my life, I suddenly found myself completely free. And with the exception of some important relationships in my life, I really left with no responsibilities, no commitments, no set time schedule, no job to come back to. You see, at that point, I had no other agenda than to let my soul emerge and allow God to show up wherever he or she wanted to at that point. I was completely free. And I could ride 2 miles a day, I could ride 80 miles a day. It didn't matter. I was completely free. You know, we often use that tired phrase, let go and let God. Well, I realized that I had really let go of just about everything that I had, possessions, responsibilities, and commitments. And it was a wonderful opportunity as I was able to then say to God, God, I'm open season. You can now do anything you want with me. And I have to tell you that it was a gift and an opportunity that was worth every dollar and every pedal stroke of those 2,500 kilometers. Because unlike my first pilgrimage, where I rode like a man on a mission, trying to accomplish something, this pilgrimage I actually let come to me. And the amazing thing is, all I did was one thing. I simply created the space. All I had to do was create the space in my life and then let God do the rest. After 8 years of continual losses in my life, I went out so that I could restore my soul, so I could feel alive again, so I could feel joy and laughter and love after so much loss and death. And the words of the psalmist were very close to my heart. As the deer pants, I love that language. As the deer pants for flowing streams, so my soul longs for you. My soul thirsts for the living God. I have probably 10 hours of experiences that I could share with you, but I'm not going to. But I want to just share one that really was the answer to the prayers and the reason for the pilgrimage. I started in Rome and stayed in Rome for 4 or 5 days, seeing the sights there at the Vatican, and then went south along the coast and east across the middle of Italy. And one of the things about that experience is that I was never able to relax in Italy. And it had to do with a couple of things. One is that there was a great deal of traffic and no shoulders, and even though I felt fairly safe, I felt like I was pushing all the time, sort of to get done with the day, just to get out of the traffic. So I never really relaxed. The other thing is that Italy was expensive. As a cyclist, I would go through 10 to 15 bottles of water a day, but they charged me every time. So just the water itself was costing me about 10 to 15 euros, a good $20 a day, just to have water. So I felt like I wanted to get through as quickly as I possibly could. About 2 weeks in, I took the ferry from Bari, Italy, to Igoumenitsa, Greece, and I arrived there about an hour before sunrise. And as the sun came up, there were these massive mountains on the west coast of Greece. I was born in Bozeman, Montana. I grew up in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. I went to college close to the Sawtooths in Idaho. And so one of the things about me is that the mountains are in my soul. For the next 3 days, I was able to ride through the mountains of Greece, and I finally began to settle. My soul began to emerge. Climbing up 12, 13, 14 switchbacks to the top of a mountain, riding by a herd of goats coming down the mountain, outrunning packs of sheepdogs who were trying to protect their little flock, and riding through mountains where storm clouds were threatening just above me. I felt completely at home. And the one moment where things began to open up for me again was when a song from my childhood, my teenage years, came back to me from Dan Fogelberg. It's called Netherlands. And here is the verse on the second day of being in the mountains that I found myself repeating and singing over and over again. Off in the Netherlands I heard a sound, like the beating of heavenly wings. And deep in my brain I can hear a refrain of my soul as she rises and sings. Anthems to glory and anthems to love, and hymns filled with earthly delight, like the songs that the darkness composes to worship the light. That day was the beginning of restoring my soul and beginning to live again, to love again, and to feel again. My encouragement to you this Lent is simply to create space. You don't have to do more. You just need to be intentional about doing less. Create space, and then let God do the rest. I wish you great blessings on your own journeys. Amen.